Hi, my name is Rebecca Warren, and I am making this presentation based on the paper I wrote spring 2024. And I've called this a dirty game. Basically the topic is the United States practice of exporting coal and what that might mean in terms of international climate treaties. Okay, I think I have maybe mentioned this before, but I do have a personal connection to coal. I'm from Kentucky, and my grandfather was a coal miner. So I was a witness to a lot of the exploitation that happened by the coal industry. And so a lot of my environmental topics of research have been focused on coal, things like mountaintop removal and other things. So let's just start out by talking about coal. Why is coal such a problem? Well, it's the single biggest contributor to climate change, largest source of CO2 emissions, more than oil, more than gas. So it's a very carbon intensive fuel, the most carbon intensive fossil fuel. So it is a primary driver of climate change. And it is still increasing in usage globally. Now, the United States has decreased its consumption of coal. It doesn't burn as much coal now for electricity production as it used to. But for countries in transition, developing economies, those who have not yet gone through the same level of industrialization as the United States and Europe, for example, they are increasing their consumption of coal for energy production. So this is a problem because we know that we've got we need to reduce our emissions globally to minimize the effects of climate change and limit global warming. Okay. All right. So we've known since the late 1800s that global warming was an issue. So at that point, it was a chemist actually who discovered that burning coal led to a change in the atmospheric composition. Now, at that time, atmospheric studies were really more in the hands of the physicists and the mathematicians, and there wasn't as much cooperation between the sciences as there is now. But as the decades progressed, there was more and more that was discovered about what burning fossil fuels does to our atmosphere. And so now it's fairly there's pretty broad consensus that burning fossil fuels and coal in particular does change our atmospheric composition, and it does increase our global temperature. So was about 100 years later that the United Nations Environment Program established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which led to our first climate treaty, which was the UNFCCC. Okay, that's very long. It stands for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that was our first climate treaty. The United States is a party to that treaty. It was ratified with the advice and consent of the Senate, and it basically established that we agree globally. We agree that this is something that is happening. We don't have all the particulars. There, is still even now some scientific uncertainty about what will happen or what may happen, but with a pretty high degree of confidence, we know that this is happening. And so this was kind of the first time that the world kind of came together and said, okay, we need to address this and make sure that this doesn't really put us at risk. So we had a lot of outgrowth agreements from the UNFCCC. The most significant, I think, and most recent potentially is the 2015 Paris Agreement. At that point, we were actually starting to quantify. So now we have established that we really need to limit global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And what the Paris Agreement did was it put on the countries who are party to the treaty, so I call them country parties, they are now required to establish their own contributions to the solutions. Okay, so in terms of how much they can limit their emissions, for example. So the Paris Agreement really brought things to kind of a quantifiable level for the first time. Well, maybe not exactly for the first time, but it was there was this consensus that we are all going to set our limits, and it is numerical and it's quantified. So the United States has set its contributions, and there are kind of progress reports every year at the Conference of the Parties. So the countries come together and they update and submit to the United Nations. Here is what we are doing. And so, by the way, we are a party to the Paris Agreement. It was not ratified with the advice and consent of the Senate. However, when President Biden rejoined the Paris Agreement after President Trump had withdrawn, that executive agreement does become binding on the United States. So if you go to the Senate webpage and you read about treaties, it will tell you that executive agreements are binding on the United States. And we are complying with the Paris Agreement to a large degree in terms of our contributions that we have set. So each country sets its own contributions based on what they can do, and they're required to be ambitious. But there are a lot of principles that kind of go into establishing what the contributions should be, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But basically, we know we have to stop burning fossil fuels, and in particular coal, because it is the dirtiest of them all. Okay, so let's just kind of take a look here at what the United States is doing with its coal. Our consumption has dropped pretty significantly. We have transitioned into the newer technologies with sustainable renewable energy production, and so our coal consumption has dropped, but our production hasn't significantly changed, even though our consumption has dropped. Our exports are increasing, particularly to countries in transition, like I mentioned before, those who are still developing in terms of their economics and haven't gone through the industrialization process like the United States did decades ago. So one statistic that I found really compelling here was that steam coal, not metallurgical coal, but steam coal exports to China more than quadrupled from 2022 to 2023. We also see a lot of exports to other countries in transition. We export to countries that are not in transition as well, but when you look at our exports to China in particular, this is kind of like just an example of how we see the developing countries or countries in transition increasing their coal consumption. So this gets a little bit more into the Paris Agreement than you probably want to hear about. But globally, this is a major issue when we consider global warming. Okay, so we have to kind of think about this from kind of two sides. We have our individual goals, which each country sets in terms of our nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. So those are our individual goals. Like, what are we going to do? How are we limiting our greenhouse gas emissions and other things? But then you also have to think about the collective, cooperative side of this, right? Because so globally, collectively, we're looking at climate change, which is going to affect us all. So climate change will not affect one country significantly differently than its neighboring country. So one country may be not using any fossil fuels at all, but if their neighbor is using a lot of fossil fuels, everyone is going to be affected by this. So this is global. So when the UNFCCC kind of first was brought to the table, it was understood that this is a collective goal and that cooperation is required. And so this is kind of everyone's problem. We all have to be on board to try to solve this, even though there are some countries that did not really contribute to the problem at all. They are still not really in that industrialization or developing kind of phase where they are consuming a lot of fossil fuels. And a lot of times those countries are the most negatively affected by climate change, things like rising sea levels. We see a lot of the low-lying islands very significantly affected, but they did not really contribute to the problem. So we have to really think collectively here, not just from our own individual perspective. Now, one thing that I spent a little time on in my paper was talking about this idea of ambition. So ambition is implied in the UNFCCC, but it is not defined. Now, when we get to the Paris Agreement, which came much later, ambition is in that agreement multiple times, like things like the highest possible ambition, like that's, from the agreement itself, talking about really being willing to go all out and put in the hard work and the effort and make the sacrifice to really make this happen. So ambition is a concept that's really key to the Paris Agreement. But the Paris Agreement really is looking at what the individual countries are doing in terms of their contributions. What is their responsibility? And so it's not so much ambition from a collective perspective, but that ambition is implied in the UNFCCC. So we have to kind of look at it from both sides. So the question that I kind of addressed was, can an individual country that is party to these treaties, can they be meeting their ambitious goals and objectives under the treaties and yet still be violating kind of that collective goal, that spirit of the treaties, which is limiting global warming, right? Okay, so the answer to that question, I say, is yes. A country can do what it says it's going to do under the Paris Agreement with its contributions and still be violating the international agreement. So there's this idea of backtracking. Now, typically, backtracking is anything that a country does that kind of undermines the progress. So, for example, having policies that allow for a lot of oil and gas development or something like that. So things that are happening within the country in terms of policies and actions that really are not in line with limiting global warming. So the idea of backtracking, though, is not just something that that I argue is an individual country responsibility or action or effect, but it's also something that you can look at from a collective perspective. So what I argue in the paper is that exporting coal and increasing exports of coal to countries in transition is a type of backtracking from a collective standpoint. So basically what we're doing when we are reducing our own consumption, but increasing exports, knowing that steam coal is going to be burned for electricity somewhere else, we're just shifting those emissions. So yeah, we're not consuming it ourselves, but we're shifting it downstream. So the emissions aren't coming from us. We look really good, right? We can go to the conference of the parties and we can submit our reports and we can demonstrate, looking at the data, we can clearly demonstrate that we are doing what we said we would do and limiting our emissions, but we are not really in the spirit of the treaty when we are just shifting those emissions downstream. Okay. All right. So basically, this is undermining our global progress. We're not on track to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're facilitating other countries' dependence on coal. New coal energy production facilities are being built around the globe. So we are facilitating this dependence on fossil fuels. We can see transitioning countries develop without this heavy reliance on coal. And by doing this, engaging in this practice, we're really affecting future generations because they will be the ones that live with the effects of global warming. Okay, so some solutions. We can look at this from a domestic perspective, and we can also look at this from an international perspective. So we just recently saw President Biden issue it's called the liquefied liquefied natural gas ban, but really it's putting a halt on new export permits of liquefied natural gas. And basically, that's a supply side policy. Like, we have this, we can offer it, but looking at supply side policies such as that ban is something that we could do through the executive branch. So that's one possibility. And basically, President Biden said, like, hey, let's pause this for now until we really determine what the environmental effects are. So we haven't really seen yet what the results of that will be. But also, it requires kind of a shift in values. Like, we tend to look at everything in economic terms. Like, we have this, it's in demand. Demand has not yet even peaked globally. So other countries are really, wanting the coal. So the demand is there. But to implement some of these supply side types of policies, we really have to think about this from a different perspective. Instead of just looking at what is economically beneficial, we have to kind of shift our value to looking more at what is fair, what is equitable, not only for our current generations, but also future generations. Also, in the International Court of Justice, which has jurisdiction to consider any disputes under these climate treaties, they are currently scheduling oral arguments. They accepted a case where the United Nations General Assembly basically asked them, can you please just determine, that's not the language they used, but can you tell us what are the responsibilities of the countries when it comes to climate change? And so they decided to take that under consideration, and they accepted comments from the different country parties. So there was a very long period of time, I think almost a year, where the countries could submit their comments. The United States did submit a comment. We don't know what it says yet because it hasn't been released to the public, but the International Court of Justice is going to take this under their advisement. So we'll see what happens with that. Okay, that's basically it in a nutshell. We need to stop using coal, not just the United States, but globally. We need to see a shift to the newer technologies that are available that are clean. Clean coal is only a little bit cleaner. It's not putting things into the air. It's either washing it and putting it into water, or it's solidifying it. We still have it. So there you go. There's my presentation on my paper on dirty coal. Thanks so much.